This is Tarkov running at 30 FPS base and, through the power of lossless scaling, going to 60 FPS with frame generation. There are upsides and downsides to this software, and today I'm going to cover them both. Even though I'm overall positive about lossless scaling as a whole, there are a couple of specific things regarding Tarkov and most first-person shooters that sort of differ. So in today's video, I'm going to discuss what exactly you need to know about lossless scaling frame generation and the pros and cons that you might encounter. Hopefully through this video, you'll get the best setup for your lossless scaling that you can to make your experience with it the best that you can make it. I'll also have my opinion in there on when you should use lossless scaling frame generation, but of course that is subject to change based on your personal experience with it and what you're sensitive to as far as latency is concerned. If this video helps you, make sure to hit the usual buttons down below, and also if you have any questions, ask them in the comments below or in my Discord, which is the first link in the video description. There are a ton of people in there who can help you out. Also, I stream on Fridays at 6:30 p.m. CST and Sunday at 1:30 p.m. CST. So if you need any help, just come to the chat and ask me live and I'll try my best to help you out then too. But yeah, enough about that. Let's get into the video so the video doesn't go on for too long. There are a couple things you need to know before attempting to use lossless scaling. First and foremost, if you try to use lossless scaling in any aspect, no pun intended, you're going to want to make sure you are on borderless instead of full screen. This is so that lossless scaling can correctly capture the window and then use its overlay to size it correctly to your screen. For Tarkov, to disable full screen, all you want to do is go to the settings and then go to graphics, and then here you can just set screen mode from full screen to borderless. After you've done that, you're going to want to make sure that any sort of overlay is turned off before you begin using lossless scaling. This includes Discord, any sort of NVIDIA or AMD overlay from Adrenaline or from GeForce Experience or NVIDIA app now. This also includes things like RTSS, which I actually currently have open. You don't want to have any sort of overlay over the game because lossless scaling just takes the window. So if you apply any overlays, it's going to take that part of the overlay and apply the frame generation, everything to that, which can cause significant issues with artifacting on those overlays. So be very careful to not have those on when you're using lossless scaling. Also, to avoid any issues that you may have with lossless scaling attempting to capture things that are, for example, ran as administrator, I would recommend booting up lossless scaling as an administrator. Luckily, they have something in the settings tab that you can just turn on to have it automatically start as admin on every single launch. This can also alleviate some of the performance issues you may have with it too, so I recommend to have this on for most people for compatibility's sake. Since we're in here, I'll also mention that the scale hotkey is in here too. This is defaulted to Control, Alt, and S, but you can set this to whatever you want. To scale using this hotkey, you can just hit it when you're in the window that you want to scale, and it will scale that window. Alternatively, you can also just use the scale button here and then simply Alt-Tab back into Tarkov. But you can do either way. Finally, and the ironic thing is, you do need a frame cap for lossless scaling to have the correct frame pacing. If you simply run uncapped FPS, you may feel increased latency or unevenness while playing with the frame pacing of generated frames. I highly recommend to set a frame cap at the lowest FPS that you typically see when you're playing a match. There are only a couple ways to do that I could see with Tarkov so far, because some of the other external applications that were previously recommended with lossless scaling, such as Special K's frame limiter, simply get kicked out by BattleEye upon injection attempt. So I'll lead you through a couple ways that you could do it, but there's not many. Firstly, there is the NVIDIA app, or the NVIDIA control panel, which you can use to apply a frame limit. I was having some issues with this myself, but I'll still show it to you regardless. If you go to Program Settings and select Escape from Tarkov or whatever app you want, there is a max frame rate option that you can choose and set to your preferred frame rate to base it off of. This should apply on game restart, but I was having some issues with it properly applying. Instead, what I used was Riva Tuner Statistics Server, which, as you know, comes with, say, MSI Afterburner if you watched my video about that. To quickly show you how to set that, I'm going to open up my RTSS again, along with my benchmarking software. Now that I have RTSS open, I have the Escape from Tarkov exe already added. If you don't, you just hit Add and find where that exe is stored in your drive, and then select it to place it here. Once you have it, you can set the frame cap right here to whatever you fancy. For example, If I was playing on customs and the highest FPS that I could get to consistently without falling under was about 55, I would set that to 55 and run from there. That's not an ideal frame rate to be using frame generation from, but it's enough of a start. I'll go over what I would recommend for frame generation for Tarkov soon, but that's just an example number. Once you set that, you can use the in-game FPS counter, which you can go to by opening the console, which is typically bound on tilde, and then hitting FPS 1 into the console. I will show you your FPS here to ensure that it is capped correctly. I know that's a lot of caveats before we even begin talking about lossless scaling, but all those things are very common issues that people sometimes forget before trying to use lossless scaling, and I figured I'd try to spare you a bit of that headache. Now let's talk about my methodology here. For the gameplay that you've been seeing behind you on the screen, I've been using the lossless scaling frame generation version 3.0 on 2x mode from 30 to 60 FPS. The resolution scale was at max, and the max frame latency was at 1, with sync mode set to default. The capture API was also DXGI. We'll get to what all of that means very soon, but I figured I'd lay out those caveats so you guys understand what's going on behind you. Because I was running at such a low FPS as my base, I had plenty of GPU headroom. You need some sort of GPU headroom in order to run lossless scaling effectively. What I mean by this is you need to make sure that your GPU usage is significantly below 100%. You need some sort of headroom there in order for lossless scaling to have the processing power it needs to make the frame generation. Typically, if you're frame capping significantly below what you typically get in a raid, this shouldn't be an issue. But if you're running very intensive settings and at a higher resolution with a weaker GPU, this may start to be a concern. I would highly recommend tweaking your in-game settings using my settings guide, or for example, simply running, if you're on an NVIDIA card, DLSS at quality to try and help you get a lower GPU usage before attempting to use frame generation. The exact percentage that you need varies per GPU. It's not simply a measurement that I can tell you you need like 30% in order to use frame generation. It's not that simple. But generally, if you have a significant chunk of GPU usage free, then you should be okay with lossless scaling. If you need to measure the impact, you can temporarily have your overlay enabled just so that you can see the GPU usage. You could use something like NVIDIA's Frame View or your AMD Adrenalin control panel or your typical MSI Afterburner overlay to see what your GPU usage is looking like. I have guides talking about all that stuff in separate videos that I'll link down below. Once you know that you have enough GPU headroom to run frame generation, we can continue with the rest of the video. Let's get into the actual settings now. Scaling type, if you say go to NIS or FSR or LS1, will increase the GPU overhead of running lossless scaling. So, to try and reduce the performance impact and make it so you don't have to sacrifice as much, I would leave scaling type 2 off and instead use the sharpening filters or whatever else you need in game to get the desired effect. The only way that this would help you is if you then set the resolution of the game at a lower than native resolution, which also you don't want to do. You have upscalers in the game that can already do this for you. However, this does come in handy for games that don't have any sort of upscaling in them, but this is not one of those games. Going back over to scaling mode though, I would recommend leaving this at auto and aspect ratio. You don't need to set a custom aspect ratio for this because you're already running in a borderless window. And for the aspect ratio, this is fine because you're already in full screen and it'll scale correctly. Let's move to the interesting bits that I know y'all are waiting for. As you may see, there are several different options you can choose for the frame generation version. You want to go with the most recent. If you're watching this a while later from when this is posted, we may have new versions of the frame generation technology that you'd be able to use instead. For us though, we're going to be using 3.0, which gives us the following options down here: mode and resolution scale. The mode of frame generation entirely depends on your base frame rate. It also depends on the max refresh rate of your display. So for example, if you are on a 144Hz display and you're able to hit 72 FPS at a minimum, you can set your frame cap to 72 and then activate ×2 frame generation to hit 144 FPS, and that will all be displayed to your monitor. However, if your monitor's refresh rate was say 75 Hz and your base resolution or your base frame rate that you could hit at a minimum was 60, using frame generation to go from say 60 to 75 is not recommended. So you shouldn't be using it in that use case. This is most useful when you have a refresh rate that's fairly high, typically 120 and above. Keep in mind though that the higher you put this mode, for example ×3 frame generation, means that you have 2 generated frames in between each real frame. So the more you press this, you will notice increased motion fluidity but also at the same time, you will get increased latency the higher you set this. These modes are really only useful if you have at least something like an 180Hz display, if not 240 or 360. As for those, you could say use ×4 frame generation on say a 240Hz display from 60Hz to get to that maximum refresh rate. That'll give you the smoothness of 240Hz, but the motion responsiveness of roughly 60Hz. For most of you, I would recommend ×2, as odds are you don't have a high enough refresh rate display to take advantage of those higher modes. And no, you don't want to set your frame rate lower just to use higher modes of frame generation, as that will introduce significantly more latency to your game by not only lowering the base frame rate, but also increasing the amount of generated frames. So please don't do that. Resolution scale is up next, and this is something that a lot of people tend to mess up, me included actually at the beginning. You can see here from the description that it processes input frames at a reduced resolution and generates output of them at the original resolution. It's calculating the movement of a smaller amount of pixels on your screen, meaning that the frame generation becomes lighter to run. On the flip side, you can get significantly increased artifacts the lower you set this. It has scales of 5%, so for example, if I was at 50%, since I'm at a native 1440p, the resolution scale where it would consider the motion of pixels would be at 720p instead. According to the developer himself in an email that he sent to Ancient Gameplays, the old performance mode in LSFG 2.3 was actually at 90% resolution scale, or I should say that the performance of 3.0 at 90% resolution scale should be equivalent to the performance mode of 2.3. This is probably where I would recommend being at in Tarkov, unless you really need the extra GPU headroom. Going below this can cause more and more artifacts in motion that may hurt your gameplay more than help it. Because I have so much GPU headroom, I'm going to be keeping it at 100%. If you need some extra breathing room though, feel free to set this a little bit lower. My cutoff point would probably be around 75%, but your mileage may vary on how sensitive you are to seeing some of these artifacts. Do keep in mind as well that the artifacts that you'll see when you're in motion do depend actually on your base frame rate, because the higher base frame rate you have, typically the easier job the frame generator has to do, because there will be less movement in between each frame. Large, quick movements between different frames can cause the frame generator to kind of freak out a little bit and can cause more artifacts. So the higher base frame rate you can achieve, the overall better the presentation will look for the generated frame. Latency will also be better, like I explained before. Latency will also be better because the time between each real frame being presented is less, or the frame time between each real frame being presented is less. You still have to wait additional time to display the generated frame before displaying the next real frame, so there's always that bit of latency there, but the higher refresh rate you start at, the less total time that takes. With that little side tangent aside, let's move over quickly to the cursor options. The only one that you really need to worry about is clip cursor, since you're probably going to be running in borderless and don't need to worry about adjusting the cursor speed or scaling the cursor. Clip cursor just makes sure that the cursor stays within the game window while you are generating frames. If you don't want this and want to be able to move your cursor around more freely throughout your different monitors, for example, you may want to leave this off. Let's move next to the renderings. You have sync mode and you have max frame latency. I've seen some videos online discussing how they're not quite sure what this frame latency setting does, so I'm going to cover this first. You can basically think of this as the max amount of frames in the render queue. As you can see when you hover over the option, it says that it's controlling the number of frames that are allowed to be stored in the queue before they're submitted to render. By default, this is set to 1, which gives you the best latency possible, but you may have issues with frame pacing if you set this like this. I have not had any issues myself, and typically they do recommend for NVIDIA GPUs to have this set to 1. But if you notice that you're experiencing a lot of frame pacing issues when using lossless scaling, you may want to up this to 3. AMD users in the past were typically recommended to use 3 as the max frame latency, and I'm assuming that was the case because they didn't have any sort of anti-lag implementation. Assuming that it's typically set to 3, I'm assuming that that's why that spread around that this should be set to 3, according to the developer. I'm not sure of his actual reasoning though, but maybe we'll get some ideas of that soon. But to sum that up in general, NVIDIA users should be using 1 unless they're experiencing some sort of frame pacing issue. to where they can bump that up to 3. AMD users should also be at 3. Let's move over to the sync mode, which talks about VSync. This should default to default, which basically discards a previous frame once the next one is ready and is presented fully. You can see here that's what it says right here in the description. For default, it says discard previously presented frames if a newer frame is queued and synced for VBlank, which means the new frame is there, the old frame has been fully presented, and it is ready for delivering the next frame. Setting this to off is technically the best for latency, but when you set this to off, you are allowing for tearing to occur because it no longer waits for VBlank. It just instantly spits the frame to the display, regardless of if the old frame is done being presented. I personally don't like VSync, so I would not recommend using the VSync options, but you can use that if you're particularly sensitive to screen tearing. You can see they have different VSync options based on what you are able to hit from your base frame rate and then from frame gen. So for example, if I was using frame generation and only able to get to 120 FPS from a base of 60 from ×2, then I could use VSync half to sync that to my monitor's refresh rate, even if I had a 240 Hz monitor. For most users, I recommend default. HDR support and Gsync support are basically what the name implies, correcting the color display for HDR when you're running HDR, and for Gsync, it allows for proper support of Gsync technology when using it for the game itself. I would recommend everybody to have draw FPS on, just so that when you turn on lossless scaling, you get that frame display in the top left that shows you your base frame rate along with the generated frame rate. Next up is the capture API. There are a lot of acronyms here that a lot of people didn't know the definition of, but these can actually cause some compatibility issues if you're not careful, so listen up. DXGI, or DirectX graphics implementation, is typically most suited for people who are on Windows 11 23H2. People who ran DXGI in Windows 11 24H2, which is the most recent iteration of it, were having issues with how Windows updated this API. If this doesn't work for you and you're not able to generate frames correctly when using DXGI, swap to the Windows Graphics... oh god, what does the C stand for? Windows Graphics Capture, Jesus, API. This should work properly for those of you who are running on 24H2. For everybody else, DXGI should work properly. Also, if you plan on recording using lossless scaling, WGC is the only one that seems to work according to what I've briefly tested so far. I captured it using an external capture card, so I did not have to mess with this personally in order to capture it. If you're capturing on a single PC setup though, you may have to use WGC. I, however, had some frame pacing issues using WGC, so that's why I kept it at DXGI. You should ignore GDI or the graphics device interface, as that's just a legacy implementation that's meant for older Windows installs. If you need to check your Windows version, you can simply go to your search bar and type about and boot this up from your system settings. This will show you your Windows specs and your version, which will give you a better idea of what to set here. Remember, DXGI for 23H2 and below essentially, and then WGC for 24H2 at the moment. This might change with updates from the developer, but we'd have to just wait and see. If you only have one GPU and don't have an iGPU active on your PC, this will all just set to auto and you'll have no options like I do. However, if you have an iGPU, you may want to make sure that you set your preferred GPU to, well, your dedicated discrete GPU. You don't want it to be the integrated GPU that's on your PC. The output display is important as well if you have several different displays that you want to output to. It should automatically display to whatever display that the base window was on. Finally, the last setting you need to worry about is multi-display mode. If you have several different displays connected, you'll need to have this on if you don't want lossless scaling to automatically unscale when you tab out to go to other applications. With all that, you're done. It's set up correctly, and you can scale it with the hotkey or with this button whenever you're ready. Keep in mind, as I said at the beginning, that the base frame rate for everybody is going to be different, so their experience is likely going to be different as well. Some people are also more sensitive to the latency of frame generation than others, along with the artifacts that come with it, some of which I'll showcase now. Firstly, and the most obvious one for me, was the issue with picture-in-picture scopes. Obviously in Tarkov, this increases your GPU utilization and puts more pressure on your hardware, but more importantly, disregarding that fact, is the visual artifacts on the actual reticle itself. You can see in some of the footage I have here that the reticle just starts to fizzle especially when the scene starts to get more complex where I'm aiming. Granted that, again, as I said at the beginning of this video, that this is a 30 FPS base upscaled to 60, it showcases some of the artifacts you may see or sort of notice but fail to properly recognize when you're using lossless scaling. I notice this to be the most distracting when I'm trying to aim through bushes and trees, but your mileage may vary on where you actually see it. It might be easier for you to see on some flatter surfaces when you're aiming, as then you'll actually see that start to flicker. It's also most prevalent when attempting to do quick flicks in picture-in-picture scopes as well, because all of that change in such a short period of time, especially at a low base FPS, gets rid of a lot of data and forces it to make a lot of guesses that it's going to get wrong. The machine learning algorithm can only handle so much transition at a time, so those quick flicks make it really tough to keep the picture integrity. This is compounded by the fact that on some services, lossless scaling just failed to keep the image stable. I found this particularly easy to spot on some benches instead of the gameplay, which I'll try to showcase now for you, but this can be on any sort of surface that has pattern. It felt like there were blotches on the surfaces where it just sort of failed and just freaked out. This isn't helped by Tarkov's already shaky presentation with anti-aliasing, so this might be able to be suppressed slightly by using something like DLSS quality to try and reduce the amount of shimmering in the image. Even still, this artifact is going to be visible. And finally, that's what this comes down to, is motion fluidity, and more importantly, latency. For me, anything below 60 FPS at a bare minimum was just completely unplayable in contrast to playing it typically. Even though the latency has improved since 2.3, which I did test in the past but never really made a video about, it's still not for me in a competitive shooter. I still really like the application in other slower paced games that don't have frame generation, but for Tarkov's case, for me, where I need to land precise shots that I totally hit all the time, it just doesn't really work for me. At this low FPS especially, it was really difficult for me to keep my cursor on target, especially when trying to flick from target to target because of those generated frames adding that latency. It felt like my cursor was almost floaty and would overcorrect quite consistently, and it caused me to miss some of my shots, actually quite considerably a lot of the time. Again, this varies based on your base refresh rate, and as you go up to something like 100 FPS and then try to use frame generation to say go to 200 FPS, this can be less of an issue, though you may still feel it slightly. Lower base FPSs, especially 60 and below, is where I felt this most common. Though I should note to you all that because lossless scaling is just an overlay, there is no worry of having to worry about any bans or anything from the software. Unless you're, say, streaming your gameplay and BSG specifically makes a statement and bans a streamer for it or whatever, there's no evidence to suggest that you can be banned for it, and it is not something that you get detected on from BattleEye or anything like that. I would hope it's not, as it doesn't offer you any sort of competitive advantage compared to anybody else, as often it's a disadvantage to your latency, which actually puts you at a disadvantage in combat. That gets to my overall recommendations on should you run this in Escape from Tarkov. For me, the answer is no. When I'm playing PvP especially, and I need that quick reaction time, it does not help to have any sort of sluggish input delay at all. I know for some of you, that opinion is different, and that's completely fine. I don't think this is a bad application at all, and especially for people who play PvE, where generally there is less of a need to be super reactionary to things, it can help. It can make your game a lot smoother and give you a more immersive experience, which is, in my opinion, what PvE is about. Also, when you're playing online, there are some issues with frame pacing when scavs are spawning in and stuff like that, especially if you're not set at a low enough base. If you're really close to your CPU ceiling in terms of frame rate, you're going to feel a lot more hitching and stuttering than if you were to set it a little bit lower than that ceiling. So be careful and try to set it to something that's slightly lower than the lowest that you hit in terms of frame rate to try and keep a smooth presentation. I think for Tarkov as a whole, I talked about this a lot on stream, where I just didn't like the input delay, and I know a lot of people can't really perceive the input delay. So, I mean, if you're one of those people, then running this, I guess, is a no-brainer, because you just get increased motion fluidity at no perceivable impact to your input latency. There is, regardless, that input latency though, so please do consider that before having a run with lossless scaling. Regardless, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope it cleared up some things about lossless scaling. I tried my best to explain things the best that I could with my knowledge right now. And of course, some things may change, or I may have gotten some things incorrect, and I'll post whatever I can in the pinned comment in the description. Again, if you have any questions, make sure to join my Discord down below. It's the first link in the Discord description. Discord description? What am I saying? You know what I mean. And also, make sure to check out my streams on YouTube and Twitch, linked below, on Fridays, 6:30 p.m. CST, and Sundays, 1:30 p.m. CST. I'll be here. Thank you again for watching the end of this video. Make sure to hit the usual buttons down below, like and subscribe. And thank you for all the support recently. But yeah, thank you for watching. And for now, this is Clem, clocking out. Later.